Alistair Begg observed, God wrote a pop song. In late 1965, Pete Seeger and the Byrds made Ecclesiastes chapter 3 famous in pop culture with their hit song, Turn, Turn, Turn. Most of the words came from the first part of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. The song comforts many people who think to themselves, it doesn't matter how bad things get, good times are coming. Life ebbs and flows, and if I'm in a bad season now, then good times are just around the corner. However, the comfort of turn, turn, turn doesn't seem to accurately communicate Solomon's mood or intention in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Tommy South sums it up this way. In Ecclesiastes 1 and 2, Solomon has been reporting on his grand experiment with life, how he had tried virtually everything in his frantic search for meaning, and had come up empty. He had tried human wisdom, pleasure, money, possessions, alcohol, sex, all that people still try today in an effort to fill the emptiness in their lives. At the beginning of chapter 3, a change occurs. Solomon stops reporting and starts reflecting on what he has learned about life. Our text this morning is Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. There's a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. What does the worker gain from his toil? I've seen the burden God has laid on men. He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the hearts of men. Yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there is nothing better for men than to be happy and do good while they live, that everyone may eat and drink and find satisfaction in all his toil. This is the gift of God. I know that everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it so that men will revere him. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. In these verses, we see first that Solomon has some observations about the way life is, verses 1 through 9. Denny Petrillo says some of the most powerful, concise statements about life found anywhere in literature appear at the beginning of chapter 3. Verse 1 serves as an introductory statement, describing in general terms what is made more specific in verses 2 through 8. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under heaven. Then we have the description, beautiful description, of the time to be born, the time to die, so forth. We basically have 28 actions listed. They're listed in 14 pairs, and they are polarities, that is, they're opposites. The actions describe life and speak of the providential workings of God. A key to understanding the actions in 3:1 through 8 is to see them as proper behaviors in given situations, considering the rule and guidance of God. This poem is beautiful. It's a profound statement about the way life is. But what is the point? What do these verses mean? It seems that they can be understood either positively or negatively. Understood positively, the poem describes the orderliness of life. There is a time and a place for everything. God made it this way, so we should rejoice in it. While there is a great deal of truth in that observation, it does not seem to be Solomon's point here. At the conclusion of the poem, notice what Solomon says. What does the worker gain from his toil? This question reminds us of chapter 1, verse 3. What does man gain from all his labor, at which he toils under the sun? Solomon does not conclude the poem with words of appreciation, but with words of frustration. The oppositeness of life seems to leave him despairing, not rejoicing. Charles Swindoll observes that each element in each pair in verses 1 through 8 cancels out the other. And 1 minus 1, as we know, is 0. Verse 9 indicates that the poem seems to not be about the orderliness of life, but about the futility of life. Solomon observes that life is ambiguous, constantly changing, and not always fair. No one can ever say, now this is what life is all about. Life is not that simple, and it defies simplistic analysis. When within life there is room for both tears and laughter, building and destroying, killing and healing, loving and hating, life does not yield its answers easily, and those who look for simplistic answers are bound to face frustration and despair, just as Solomon did. Therefore, Solomon's observation about life is that it can be frustrating and often confusing and seldom, if ever, easy. Well, we have the poem and Solomon's observation about it. But would they then see Solomon's interpretation of what to make of the way life is? In light of verse 9, a significant change occurs beginning at verse 10. The great change is that Solomon brings God into the picture, and that alters the way he interprets what he sees. Now he can make sense out of the confusion which life has thrown at him. Solomon's main point is that God is the sovereign ruler of all life. God is in control of all of it. He says, I have seen the burden God has laid on men, verse 10. The English Standard Version says, I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. God has given us something to do. In light of God's purposes, everything has a place, a function. He has made everything beautiful in its time. The New American Standard says he has made everything appropriate in its time. While several translations have beautiful, appropriate, I think, is a better translation and should be so translated here. Life is complex. Have you noticed? Life is complex, and numerous responses to life are appropriate at various times. Now, everything is not appropriate in and of itself, but appropriate in its time. We're not always able to see the appropriateness of any given situation, but God sees it and knows it. Robert Davidson describes life as similar to a fine tapestry. Viewed up close, where we see and experience life, it is difficult to make sense of the whole. But if we could only step back far enough to see life as God sees it, then we would be able to discern the pattern and get the whole picture. In making this observation, we should avoid the conclusion that, as is often stated, everything happens for a purpose, as if God were responsible for every event that takes place in our lives. Much of what happens in life is senseless and sinful, and God is not responsible for that. The truth is that God takes everything that does happen, for whatever reason it happens, and causes it to work for the good of those who love Him. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 states, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to his purpose. Paul's statement is not far from the thought of Solomon in our text. To help us realize this truth, Solomon says, God has also set eternity in the hearts of men, yet they cannot fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Many people tend to believe that there is more to life than what they can see. Yet none of us are able to see beyond the present. We know what's happened in the past. We know what is happening now. But we cannot predict the future. This is part of our nature. God made us this way. Recognizing that there is more than we can see, that is eternity, leads us naturally to our need for God. God knows what is in the future. Michael Eaton observes that our consciousness of God is part of our nature. The suppression of it is part of our sin. We need to realize and accept our dependency on God rather than try to figure out and control life for ourselves. That's the way of the world. To just try to do things yourself. To live a life without God. But as believers in God, we should be different. Once we accept our role in the world, we can let God be God. As I mentioned before, I love the prayer led by a friend some years ago. He would say, "You are God, and we are not." The sooner we realize that, the better off we will be. God is God. We are not God. We cannot control the universe. That's God's job. And when we recognize that God is in control, we find enjoyment and genuine satisfaction in life. Solomon describes the picture of a man being happy, doing good while they live, eating and drinking, finding satisfaction. He says this is the gift from God. Yes, satisfaction is God's gift. We cannot manufacture it for ourselves. Some things in life we can change. Many things we cannot change. Many experiences are frustrating and puzzling. We must accept these and submit them to God for His use and blessing. The things we cannot change, we need to submit to God. Dave L. Bland says, verse 15 recalls the words of chapter 1, verse 9. Except this time, the name of God is brought into the scenario. The poem in 1, 3 through 11 was void of any reference to the deity. But here the message seems to be that God takes responsibility for what lies beyond human control. God has set up the seasons of life, the time, and all kinds of things happened. And some of them are in contrast to other things that are similar. What meaning can we obtain from Solomon's observation and interpretation? One thing we can observe is that life is still very much an up and down affair. Some things in our life make no sense to us. We find things confusing and perhaps decidedly unfair. At times it is hard to see any meaning in what is happening in our lives. We have more questions than we have answers. We may not be satisfied with this state of affairs, but it is a realistic understanding of the way life is. It is unhealthy to deny it. We may pretend that we understand everything and that we have an answer for every perplexity. But the truth is, we do not, and neither does anyone else except God. A choice must be made in how we respond to the realities of life. And we have only two choices. First, we can respond in despair. We can conclude that life is hopeless. We can join Solomon in his wearying refrain that life is meaningless. But this will lead to a sour existence, and we will become cynical and joyless. Or, second, we can respond in faith. Certainly life is confusing, but as Christians we are convinced that it does have meaning, even if we cannot see that meaning. God knows, even if we do not. Even though life is often unfair, God will take care of that in the end. Until that end, He will sustain us. By faith, we do not need to understand what life is all about. We need only to trust the one who does understand and who is in complete control. Such faith is not, as some charge, blind or ignorant. It merely recognizes what no one can reasonably deny. Life is beyond our understanding. Faith chooses to believe that because of God, life has purpose. We ask, where did the time go? There aren't enough hours in the day. I've got to make the most of my time. When will my time come? For the young, time often seems to move too slowly. For those who are older, time moves too quickly. Isaac Watts reminds us, time, like an ever-flowing stream, bears all its sons away. We live in time. We live in anticipation of when time will be no more. How do we live in time in anticipation of eternity? Solomon points us in the right direction. God must be in the picture. In Jesus, the direction becomes clear. Are we living in time for Jesus? If not, it's about time we begin.